The Second World War has its monuments and its myths. We know the beaches of Normandy, the siege of Stalingrad, the battles that saved civilization from fascism. At the center of this story stands Winston Churchill, the bulldog prime minister who rallied Britain with speeches and cigars, the man who never surrendered. But history is messier than legend, and the cost of victory was often paid by people who never chose to fight. There's a chapter of World War II that rarely makes it into Western textbooks. It's not about tanks or torpedoes. It's about economics and how a policy designed in London killed 3 million people in India without firing a shot. In 1943, while the world watched Europe, the province of Bengal starved. Men, women, and children, British subjects, died in rice fields and city streets. For decades, historians called it a natural disaster, a cyclone, crop failure, an act of God. But the forensic work of economists has revealed something darker. The Bengal famine wasn't a natural catastrophe. It was a man-made financial crisis, the direct result of policies designed to finance Britain's war in Asia by destroying India's currency. This is the story of how an empire starved millions of its own people to balance a war budget. The imperial money machine. By 1943, Britain was broke. We know the story. They'd sold assets to America, mortgaged their future for Lend-Lease. But they still needed vast resources to fight Japan. The Japanese army had stormed through Southeast Asia, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and now stood at India's doorstep. Britain needed to turn India into a massive military base. 2 million soldiers to feed, airfields to build, roads, barracks, uniforms, ammunition, steel. All of it cost money. But Britain didn't have money. They couldn't pay Indian contractors in pounds. Those were needed to buy food for Britain. They couldn't pay in gold. The gold was gone. So they invented a system that was, in essence, institutionalized theft. It was called the sterling balances system. Here's how it worked. London orders supplies from India. The Reserve Bank of India, controlled by the British, prints rupees to pay local farmers and contractors. In exchange, Britain deposits a paper IOU in the Bank of England. Sounds normal, right? Except there's a catch. These IOUs are frozen. India can't convert them to dollars or use them to buy goods internationally. They're just numbers on a ledger, a promise that Britain will pay back after the war. Meanwhile, the printing presses run hot. To pay for the massive war effort, British authorities flood India with paper currency. Between 1939 and 1943, the money supply in India increases by over 300%. Any economist will tell you what happens when you triple the money supply without increasing goods. Inflation. Massive, runaway inflation. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. Every rupee printed was a tax on every Indian who held rupees. The wealth wasn't destroyed, it was transferred. It flowed from the pockets of peasants and laborers into the war machine. It was taxation without representation taken to its most lethal extreme. The price of rice prices across India begin to climb. But in Bengal, the situation becomes catastrophic because inflation hits the one thing that matters most: rice. Rice isn't just food in Bengal, it's survival. For poor, landless laborers who make up most of the population, life depends on rice prices. They live on the edge, spending 80% of their daily income just to buy enough calories to see tomorrow. When Britain starts printing billions of rupees to fund the war, the money in laborers' pockets becomes worthless. Rice prices tick upward. They double, then triple. This is the first jaw of the trap. Britain is financing the defense of India by destroying the purchasing power of India's poor. They're taxing peasants through inflation. The second jaw is even more vicious. The denial policies. In 1942, Japan conquers Burma, the world's largest rice exporter. Much of that rice had gone to Bengal. Now the supply is cut off. But the real fear is that Japan will keep advancing. British commanders look at Bengal's geography and see vulnerability. The Ganges Delta is a maze of rivers and canals. The entire economy runs on boats, tens of thousands of small wooden vessels moving grain from fields to markets. British generals worry that if Japan invades, they'll use these boats to move troops quickly across the delta, just as they used bicycles to conquer Malaya. So Churchill and his cabinet authorize a scorched earth strategy, the boat denial policy. British soldiers and police fan out across coastal Bengal. They seize boats, burn them on riverbanks, or sink them midstream. In total, they destroy or confiscate nearly 46,000 boats. For military planners, it's strategic necessity. For Bengal's economy, it's a death sentence. By destroying the boats, they destroy the distribution system. Fishermen can't fish. Farmers can't get harvests to market. The circulatory system of the economy is severed. Simultaneously, they implement the rice denial policy. Fearing the Japanese will seize local stocks, British authorities move into rural districts and confiscate surplus rice, often at below-market, government-fixed prices. They move it into massive warehouses in Kolkata to feed soldiers and essential industrial workers. They strip the countryside of food reserves, break the transport network, and flood the market with worthless money. It's the perfect recipe for famine. Nature lights the fuse, then nature provides the spark. On October 16, 1942, a massive cyclone slams into coastal West Bengal. It kills thousands and destroys a significant portion of the rice crop in the coastal districts. In a functioning system, this would be tragedy, not genocide. A responsible government would import food from other regions, use railways to move grain from Punjab's wheat belt to Bengal's rice belt, control prices. But the British administration is paralyzed by war priorities. Railways are fully booked moving troops and munitions to the Eastern Front to defend against the Japanese threat. There's no room for civilian food. The priority is war, not people. The British military logic was clear. Lose Bengal to famine and you still hold India. Lose Bengal to the Japanese and the entire subcontinent might fall. It was a calculated trade-off. The lives of millions weighed against strategic necessity. The mathematics of death as 1943 dawns, rice prices spiral out of control. In January, a maund of rice, about 82 pounds, costs 10 rupees. By May, 30 rupees. By August, 80 rupees. For British officers and wealthy merchants, this is an annoyance. They have to pay more for their lunch. For agricultural laborers earning a few rupees a week, it's a mathematical impossibility. Here's the crucial point. There was actually enough rice in Bengal to feed the population. The harvest was short but not zero. Food sat in warehouses, in private stockpiles of traders. People didn't die because there was no food. They died because they couldn't buy it. This was an entitlement famine, a failure of the market. The inflation created by British war finance had priced 3 million people out of existence. This distinction is vital. Famines caused by absolute food shortage require natural disaster or total crop failure. But entitlement famines are man-made. They happen when the economic system fails to distribute available food. They are political failures disguised as natural disasters. The psychology of hyperinflation: as prices rise, panic sets in. When people realize money is losing value, they stop selling goods. Farmers and merchants look at printed rupees and don't want them. They know the paper will be worth less next week, so they hoard rice. They lock it away, waiting for prices to rise further. Grain disappears from markets. Shelves go empty. Panic buying begins. The provincial government of Bengal is incompetent and corrupt. They try price controls but can't enforce them. When government says rice can only be sold at low prices, merchants simply stop selling. The black market explodes. Meanwhile, those with access to hard currency or gold, the British officers, the wealthy Indian merchants, the zamindars, can still buy food. They outbid the poor. The market becomes an auction where survival goes to the highest bidder. It's economic Darwinism in its purest, cruelest form. The march to Kolkata by summer 1943, the countryside begins to empty. Villagers, having eaten their seed grain, sold their jewelry and pots, eaten leaves from trees, begin to walk. They walk toward Kolkata. They believe the King Emperor won't let them starve. They believe in the great second city of the empire there will be food. They're wrong. The scenes in Kolkata are Dante's Inferno made real. Tens of thousands of skeletal figures pour into the city. They collapse on sidewalks. They die on doorsteps of fine restaurants where British officers and Indian elites eat multi-course dinners. The juxtaposition is horrifying. Kolkata booms with war money. Factories run 24 hours churning out supplies for the front. Nightclubs are full. Champagne flows. And outside the window, people fight over scraps in dustbins. British authorities initially deny there's a famine. They call it a food shortage. They censor the press, forbid newspapers from using the word famine. They're terrified the news will damage morale and give propaganda ammunition to the Japanese and Gandhi's independence movement. But bodies are impossible to hide. Municipal corpse squads collect thousands weekly, dumping them in mass graves or burning them in massive pyres that fill the city with the stench of death. Photographers capture haunting images. A mother cradling a dead child. A man reduced to a skeleton lying on a Kolkata street while pedestrians step over him. Families huddled under shop awnings waiting to die. These images, when they finally reach the world, shock the conscience. But by then, the worst is already over. Churchill's calculation, the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, is remote and ineffective, more concerned with war than native suffering. But even he realizes the situation is catastrophic. He sends telegrams to London warning the War Cabinet that unless food is imported immediately, there will be a disaster that could shake British rule. He asks for ships, wheat, permission for aid from the United States, Australia, or Canada. And here the story shifts from economic tragedy to political tragedy. The decision to save Bengal or let it die rests with one man, Winston Churchill. Churchill presided over the War Cabinet. He's the hero of the West, the man who stood against Hitler. But Churchill has a blind spot about India. He's a Victorian imperialist who believes deeply in racial hierarchy. He detests the independence movement. He famously said, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." When telegrams arrive begging for food, Churchill is unsympathetic. He's focused on Europe, preparing for invasions of Italy and France. Every ship is precious. Every ton of shipping space needed to transport American troops and supplies across the Atlantic. Churchill argues the famine is Indians' fault for breeding like rabbits. He claims sending food would be useless because Indians will simply continue to multiply beyond their means. He prioritizes stockpiling food for Britain and future European liberation over immediate survival of Bengali subjects. The War Cabinet meetings are chilling to read in the historical record. When presented with death tolls, Churchill asks why, if the famine is so bad, Gandhi hasn't died yet. It's a remark that reveals not just callousness but active contempt. Britain had ships. They had wheat. Australia had massive wheat surpluses and ships ready to sail. A journey of just a few weeks to Kolkata. But London refuses the offer. They cite shipping shortages while ships laden with Australian wheat sail right past India to the Middle East to build reserve stockpiles for the British Army that aren't critically needed. The denial of shipping is deliberate. It's a calculation written on spreadsheets in Whitehall. Bengali lives are valued at zero in the grand equation of war. They're expendable assets in the imperial balance sheet. Collapse, the famine rages. Rural society in Bengal collapses. Families disintegrate. Parents sell children for a handful of rice, hoping buyers will feed them. Husbands abandon wives. Elderly grandparents walk into the forest to die so there's one less mouth to feed. People eat things that aren't food: grass, bark, dirt. They catch rats and insects. Disease follows famine like a shadow. Cholera, malaria, smallpox sweep through weakened populations. And all the while, the Reserve Bank's printing presses keep spinning, turning out paper money that fuels the war machine and stokes the inflation that's the true engine of genocide. The Bengal famine reveals a terrible truth about modern economies. Money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. And when the government controls the printing press, it controls who gets to make those claims. The British chose to direct those claims toward the war effort and away from Bengali peasants. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. By late 1943, the death toll climbs toward 3 million. Streets are cleared of living skeletons, who are trucked to destitute camps on the outskirts to die out of sight of the ruling class. Wavell's War in October 1943, Britain finally changes leadership. Lord Linlithgow retires, having never visited famine-stricken districts, and is replaced by Field Marshal Archibald Wavell. Wavell is a soldier, not a politician, a man of action. When he arrives, he does something the previous administration considered beneath them. He gets on a plane and flies to Kolkata. He walks the streets, steps over bodies, sees dying mothers trying to nurse dead infants, sees children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs. Wavell is horrified. He sends a blistering telegram to London, writing that the famine is one of the greatest disasters under British rule, and that the reputation of the British Empire is being destroyed in Bengal's rice paddies. Wavell doesn't wait for permission. He treats the famine as a military emergency. He mobilizes the Indian Army. Thousands of soldiers training to fight Japan are ordered to distribute food instead. He commandeers railways, forcing transport networks to prioritize grain over munitions. He sets up relief centers and mobile medical stations. For the first time in a year, there's a coordinated response. Army logistics and discipline bring order to chaos. The death rate begins to slow, but Wavell is fighting a fire with a water pistol. He needs massive grain imports to break inflation and stabilize markets, 1 million tons of wheat at minimum. He pleads with London for shipping. Even with a field marshal making the request, Churchill remains obstinate. He argues sending ships to India will weaken the buildup for the 1944 European invasion. He prioritizes liberating France over saving Bengal. In a secret memo that would only come to light decades later, Churchill suggests that if there's food shortage in the empire, British people should be fed first, the army second, colonial subjects last. It's a cold calculation of imperial hierarchy written in black and white. Wavell is furious. He writes in his diary that the government in London seems to regard the starvation of millions as a nuisance rather than a tragedy, an administrative inconvenience on the road to victory. He eventually secures some grain shipments from Australia and Canada, but too little, too late for the millions already perished. The famine lingers into 1944, claiming the weak and elderly through disease and malnutrition long after rice prices stabilize. The final death toll, between 3 and 4 million people. To put that in perspective, it's 6 times the casualties suffered by British Empire and Commonwealth forces in the entire Second World War. More British subjects died of hunger in Bengal than died fighting Nazis and Japanese combined. The bill comes due as bodies are cleared and war moves toward conclusion. A new battle begins, not for survival, but over the bill. Throughout the war, Britain continued forced lending, extracting goods and services from India on a colossal scale, paying with frozen IOUs known as sterling balances deposited in London. By war's end, Britain owes India a staggering sum, roughly £1.3 billion sterling, equivalent to tens of billions in today's money. It represents years of Indian labor, Indian resources, Indian blood. This creates a bizarre inversion of the colonial relationship. For 2 centuries, India had been a debtor nation paying tribute to Britain. Now Britain is the debtor and India the creditor. The colony effectively owns the mother country. But Britain's economy is shattered. They're bankrupt. They owe money to America through Lend-Lease. They owe money to the Dominions. and they owe this massive fortune to India. British Treasury officials panic. If they pay back in full, it'll crush post-war recovery, transferring real wealth from Britain to India for decades to come. So Britain tries to default. In negotiations that stretch through 1945 and beyond, leading British intellectuals, including the economist John Maynard Keynes, argue the debt should be cancelled or drastically written down. Their argument: India was saved from Japanese conquest by the British war effort, therefore India should pay for its own defense. The logic is breathtaking in its audacity. Britain borrows money from India to defend India, then argues India should pay for the privilege of being defended. Indian nationalists, now on the verge of independence, are outraged. They argue the war was forced on them without consent. The viceroy declared war on behalf of India without consulting a single elected Indian leader. The famine was the direct result of this forced contribution. 3 million people died to pay that debt. To cancel it now would be the final, supreme act of imperial theft. The negotiations are bitter and protracted. Britain tries every financial trick in the book: currency devaluation to reduce the real value of the debt, blocked accounts that prevent India from accessing the funds, linking repayment to purchases of British military hardware, effectively forcing India to spend the money back in Britain. In the end, Britain can't fully default because they need India to remain in the Commonwealth and the sterling area to prop up the pound as an international reserve currency. They agree to a slow repayment schedule that stretches over years, but the debt's value is systematically eroded by inflation and devaluation. India never receives the full real value of the resources extracted during the war. The blood of Bengal subsidized the Allied victory, and the check India received in return was written in depreciating currency. The end of empire, the political consequences are terminal for the British Raj. Before 1943, some segments of the Indian population still believed British rule, while oppressive and exploitative, brought at least stability and administrative competence. The famine destroys that illusion forever. It proves the administration isn't just morally bankrupt but functionally incompetent. It proves that in crisis, the empire will let Indians die by the millions to save Britons. It proves that all the rhetoric about the civilizing mission and the white man's burden is hollow propaganda. The Raj's moral legitimacy evaporates like morning mist. The famine energizes the Quit India movement, gives desperate urgency to independence demands, and fuels recruitment for the Indian National Army led by Subhas Chandra Bose, who had allied with the Japanese in the belief that any means were justified to drive out the British. While Bose's military campaign ultimately failed, his message resonated powerfully with a population that had watched their families starve while British officers dined well. The economic devastation also sows the seeds of partition. Bengal had always been a religiously mixed province with a delicate communal balance between Hindus and Muslims. The famine tears the social fabric apart. Competition for scarce resources, the breakdown of rural society, and mass migration to cities exacerbate communal tensions that had simmered for decades. When the British finally leave in 1947, they partition a traumatized and economically broken province into West Bengal, which joins India, and East Pakistan, which later becomes Bangladesh in 1971. The border is drawn through a land still recovering from the genocide of inflation. The pattern of empire, the tragedy of 1943, wasn't an isolated incident or an aberration. It was the culmination and logical endpoint of 200 years of imperial economics. It demonstrated the ultimate structural flaw in the colonial model. An empire is designed to extract wealth from the periphery to the center. In normal times, this extraction is carefully managed to keep the periphery alive and productive. You can't milk a dead cow. But in total war, when the center's survival is at stake, all restraints are removed. The center will cannibalize the periphery completely to save itself. The Bengal famine was imperial extraction accelerated to fatal velocity. Churchill's ledger Winston Churchill rightly deserves celebration for saving Western civilization from fascism. His speeches rallied a nation on the brink of defeat. His resolve in 1940, when Britain stood alone, was indispensable to the survival of democracy. But the history of the 20th century is incomplete, actively dishonest, without the other side of the ledger. The price of victory in Europe was paid not just on the beaches of Normandy and in the rubble of Berlin, but in the villages and rice paddies of Bengal. It was paid by people who never voted for war, never threatened Britain, never asked to be part of the empire's calculations. The denial policies, the printing of rupees, the refusal of shipping, these were decisions made by men in comfortable rooms in Whitehall, thousands of miles from the consequences. They were decisions recorded in neat minutes and filed away in leather folders. They moved numbers from one column to another on balance sheets and spreadsheets to optimize the war effort. But those numbers were human lives, mothers and children and farmers who wanted nothing more than to survive another day. The cover-up for decades after the war, the British government successfully suppressed the true scale and nature of the disaster. The official Famine Inquiry Commission report, published in 1945, was a carefully constructed whitewash. It blamed the cyclone, local hoarding by Indian merchants, and population growth. It downplayed the role of inflation, the denial policies, and the refusal of grain imports. The report's conclusion was that the famine was primarily a natural disaster with some administrative failures, regrettable but ultimately unavoidable given wartime conditions. This narrative was absorbed into textbooks and popular history. The Bengal famine became a footnote, mentioned briefly if at all in Western accounts of World War II. It took 50 years and the painstaking work of economists like Amartya Sen, himself a child survivor of the famine, to uncover the forensic evidence of how financial policy and market mechanisms were weaponized against the poor. Sen's groundbreaking work on entitlement theory demonstrated that famines in the modern era are rarely caused by absolute food shortage. They're caused by the failure of economic systems to distribute available food, failures of market access, purchasing power, and political will. The Bengal famine is his case study, a smoking gun showing how economic policy can kill as efficiently as bullets. The warning today: the Bengal famine stands as a dark warning about the relationship between finance and power. It shows that hyperinflation isn't just an economic inconvenience or a statistical anomaly. It's a weapon of mass destruction. When a government destroys its currency, whether through deliberate policy or incompetent management, it destroys the ability of the poorest citizens to live. It demonstrates that markets, left to their own devices in crisis, will distribute resources to those who can pay the most, not to those who need them most. The invisible hand becomes a fist that crushes the weakest. It reminds us that the narratives of history are written by victors, and that the good war had a dark underbelly that's been conveniently airbrushed from popular memory. The liberation of Europe was funded in part by the starvation of Asia, and it proves that empires don't end because of moral awakenings or sudden attacks of conscience. They end because they've extracted everything they can, broken the systems they controlled, and bankrupted themselves morally and financially. Britain didn't leave India in 1947 because of a sudden realization that colonialism was wrong. They left because they had drained the country so thoroughly and broken the administrative system so completely that it could no longer be governed at the profit margin empire requires. The legacy of the sterling balances, and the famine is etched permanently into the economic and political DNA of South Asia. It created a deep, abiding skepticism of global financial systems and international institutions dominated by Western powers. It fueled a drive for food self-sufficiency and strategic autonomy that defines Indian policy to this day. After independence, India became obsessed with food security, building up buffer stocks, investing in agricultural research, pursuing the green revolution with its high-yield crops. The country was determined never again to be dependent on foreign food or foreign mercy. India's non-aligned foreign policy during the Cold War, its suspicion of international trade agreements, its protectionist economic policies for decades, all of these have roots in the trauma of 1943. The famine also left a legacy of distrust between the state and citizens. The Indian government's instinct toward intervention in food markets, price controls, and rationing systems all stem from the memory of market failure in Bengal. Even today, 75 years after independence, the public distribution system provides subsidized food grains to hundreds of millions, a direct descendant of the rationing systems first established in the famine's aftermath. The final transaction, the story of the Bengal famine, is ultimately the story of the British Empire's final, brutal transaction. They cashed out their moral authority, every last penny of legitimacy earned over centuries, to purchase a military victory against Japan. They made a calculated trade, the lives of millions of colonial subjects for strategic success in Asia. They won the war. The Japanese were pushed back. India was defended. Burma was reconquered. The empire survived to see victory in 1945. But in the silence of Bengal's starving villages, in the mass graves of Kolkata, in the faces of skeletal children dying on city streets while British officers dined nearby, in all of that, the empire lost its soul. When the Union Jack finally came down over the Red Fort in Delhi on August 15, 1947, it wasn't just a political withdrawal or a transfer of power. It was a bankruptcy liquidation. The British Empire was an enterprise that had spent its last moral penny, exhausted its final reserves of legitimacy, and defaulted on the most basic obligation any government owes its people: to keep them alive. The Bengal famine was the receipt for that transaction, written in blood and filed away in the archives where the victors hoped it would be forgotten. But history has a way of remembering what power tries to forget. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.